Welcome back to the possibility of self-government. This is video 2 entitled The Meaning of Equality. In our first episode, we learned that a question that had preoccupied the Revolutionary War and Civil War generations was whether self-government could, as Lincoln put it, long endure. We saw that the institution or survival of self-government had become an issue for Americans approximately every 80 years, beginning with the Revolutionary War. We learned that Thomas Hobbes and the English followers of John Calvin, for different reasons, answered the question, no, man is not capable of governing himself in the long run. We focused most of episode 1 on John Calvin and his followers from the not possible camp. We saw that Richard Hooker, countering Calvinism in 16th century England, asserted 3 kinds of laws: divine positive laws, also known as the Bible, natural law, and human positive law. Positive law, you recall, is law posited by a lawgiver, usually in written form. Cartwright, Calvin's follower, denied the existence of the second of these, natural law, unwritten law that men discern from reason and nature. Cartwright's first objection concerned the underlying assumption of natural law that people can reason about what Aristotle calls first principles, the building blocks to all the important knowledge. First principles include axiomatic mathematical, physical, and moral law. Calvin's English followers believed that the fall of Adam left mankind without the ability to reason. According to Cartwright, the fall had 2 impacts on government. First, natural law doesn't exist. Therefore, for Cartwright, the church must run the state, just as for Thomas Hobbes, an absolute ruler, hopefully but not necessarily benevolent, must run the state. In the process of learning about Calvin's first objection to natural law, we took a close look at reason. We saw that the reason necessary to discern natural laws was the same reason Maria Montessori claimed children used to cobble together abstract concepts from images and from interaction with their environment. So that was our first episode. In this second episode, we'll learn about John Calvin's second objection to natural law. In doing so, we'll learn about equality and about part of the metaphysics of natural law. Calvin's second objection to the existence of natural law was that men, in a fundamental respect, are not created equal. Now, when we talk about equality in this course, we're not talking about equality in talent, in income, or in health. We're talking about equality in the essence of what makes us human. Let's look at what the physical world teaches us. Each of us has a head, and barring a birth defect or an accident, 2 arms and 2 legs. Those are attributes of being human, and we're equal in those respects. But this physical equality admits of lots of variety. We each have 1 head, sure, but the sizes, shapes, and colors of things like our faces, ears, noses, and hair don't argue against this fundamental physical equality that makes us human. We each, after all, still have 1 head. In the spiritual realm, equality may be seen in our identity as God's children. Each of us is a child of God. Here, too, equality admits of variety. Some sons and daughters are funnier than others. We all have different gifts and callings. Different temperaments express their spirituality in different ways. But as in the physical realm, with different shapes, sizes, and colors, none of our differences in personality, gifts, or temperament argues against our essential equality as children of God. Calvin said, quote, "All are not created on equal terms," close quote. So why did Calvin believe that men, in a fundamental respect, are not created equal? As you probably know, Calvin believed that some people are preordained to eternal damnation. Here's the logic of the Disciplinarian Calvinists that got them from preordained damnation to the lack of natural law. First, people are not equal because some are born damned. 2, reason, if it exists, is universal and would allow all to find God. I think all of the philosophers that we've looked at so far in this course would agree with that. 3, therefore, reason cannot exist. If the first 2 premises are true, then it follows that the third is the proper conclusion. Eternal damnation for some means they're not born equal, but reason requires equality. Therefore, reason cannot exist because all are not born equal. 4, natural law is based on reason. So if we take 3 and 4 now as premises, then we have to conclude number 5, natural law cannot exist. Natural law is based on reason, but reason can't exist in any way to find first principles, then natural law itself cannot exist. We see from this that equality proves natural law. Conversely, for the Disciplinarian Calvinists, the lack of equality proves that natural law does not exist. If any natural law existed for Calvin, it would have been based on God's will alone and not on God's reason. It would have been the natural law of what some might call a capricious God. From a political standpoint, equality gets its start with this philosophical basis that Calvin objected to, God's willingness that none should perish but that all should come to repentance, as the Bible puts it. Equality is based on every person's equal standing before God at his life's outset. God loves everyone the same and gives everyone the opportunity to become his mature sons. Equality, in this sense, insists on natural law. If God can reason with us through nature, then his character and chief principles may be discerned through nature. If God can use natural means to speak to everyone, then we all can be redeemed, and we all are, in that sense, equal. Otherwise, not everyone could learn morality from nature. Just as in science, no universal application means no law. If gravity didn't work in some predictable manner, we'd have no law of gravity. If some people were born without the equipment to learn morality from nature, we'd have no natural law. If you accept natural law, that is a law based on reason, then it follows that all men are created equal. Here's the logic. The first premise: laws by definition have a universal, that is a predictable application, be the law scientific, legal, or moral. 2, natural law exists. Its universal application is to all people. Those 2 premises being accepted, we must conclude that on an ontological level, all men are created equal. And you may recall that ontology is the branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being. The existence of natural law implies equality, just like the existence of reason does. That's why the most fundamental natural law, according to both Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, is that all men are created equal. If natural law exists at all, then all people must be created equal. Again, not equal in talents and abilities, income and callings, but equal in a more ontological sense, worth the same before God. Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk and prolific spiritual author, agreed with Jefferson and Lincoln that the central premise of natural law is equality. Merton said, quote, "The basic tenet of natural law is that we should treat others as we would like them to treat us, that we should not do to another what we would not want another to do to us. In other words," he says, "the natural law is simply that we should recognize in every other human being the same nature, the same needs, the same rights, the same destiny as in ourselves." Close quote. The inherent understanding that others are as human as we are may be why Lincoln called the Declaration of Independence's Equality Clause, all men are created equal, the, quote, "father of all moral principle among us," close quote. Even the right to life and the right to liberty, vital natural rights, are based on the law that, quote, all men are created equal, close quote. How? Our rights begin with who we are. The right to life? I should not be killed because I am a child of God, not an animal. The right to liberty? I should not be a slave because I am a human being, not an animal. My examples suggest a paradox. Equality requires a hierarchy. Let's look at the hierarchy of natural law's equality. Aristotle, in his Politics, described man, quote, as the in-between being. Man is neither beast nor God, close quote. The Hebrews, of course, saw things the same way as Aristotle. From the beginning to the end, God reinforces this most fundamental hierarchy. Genesis' account of creation makes clear that man is not God, and it draws a clear distinction between man and every other living thing. Likewise, Romans 8 describes 3 resurrections, the first for God, or for Jesus, who is God incarnate, the second for man, and the third, if you will, for the rest of nature. That's one reason, by the way, that nature is teaching us about God. Paul says it, quotes, waits eagerly for the revealing, i.e. the resurrection, of the sons of God, close quote. So nature itself can finally have its resurrection too. Man requires hierarchy. Without hierarchy, there is no equality. If there is no God, for instance, some men would have to become gods. Godless systems, fascism, communism in the last 100 years, never produce equality. Some man or group of men has godlike powers over other men. When whole groups lose their lives or their liberty, it's because the people taking their lives or liberty are trained to see them as animals and not people. Something happens to the fundamental hierarchy. Africans brought to America as slaves were treated as beasts. It was illegal in many places to educate them, and marriage and family ties were ignored by most slave traders and sellers. All this was to reinforce the important idea that Africans were less than human, lower in this fundamental hierarchy. How did the Nazis prepare Germany for the murder of 6 million Jews? They spent years beforehand stripping Jews of their human rights. They had a consistent propaganda campaign treating Jews as subhuman, frequently comparing Jews to vermin and the like. According to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, quote, Nazi films portrayed Jews as subhuman creatures infiltrating Aryan society. For example, The Eternal Jew, 1940 movie, directed by Fritz Hippler, portrayed Jews as wandering cultural parasites consumed by sex and money, close quote. It's easy to enslave blacks if the society believes they're beasts. It's easy to kill Jews if the society believes they're vermin. How did the South rise up with such near unanimity when the states seceded from the Union just before the Civil War? Only a small percentage of Southern whites were slaveholders, after all. The rest were poor. Southern white men, rich and poor, rose up because, in their culture, their superiority over any and every African American gave them their social status, told them who they were. As political science professor Harry Jaffa has put it, quote, their own sense of personal dignity depended on slavery, close quote. In their hierarchy, God was their God, all the white men were the men, and all the blacks were included with the beasts. I was a trial lawyer in Virginia for many years, and the appellate courts in Virginia until recently didn't put out a lot of written decisions. To argue property law, sometimes I'd have to use a Virginia Supreme Court decision enforcing a slaveholder's property rights in his slave. The court in those decisions treated the slave just like a horse or a mule. But nature, of course, teaches otherwise. Thomas Jefferson, who certainly was a hypocrite about this and knew it, famously pointed out that, quote, the general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God, close quote. Nature teaches us, Jefferson says, through a cursory look at our bodies, that no one is born to deny anyone else's humanities. I wasn't born with spurs in my heels. You weren't born with a saddle on your back. 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head. Our essential physical equality points to our essential metaphysical equality. Thomas Merton again, quote, "The plainest summary of all the natural law is to treat other men as if they were men, not to act as if I alone were a man and every other human were an animal or a piece of furniture." Close quote. It seems ludicrous to speak of it, men treating other men like horses, as Jefferson put it, or as furniture, as Merton put it. But of course it is happening all over the world when men on an individual level, like Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov, or men on a governmental level, violate this vital hierarchy and kill, imprison, or enslave others. Man does require hierarchy. Therefore, if all men are created equal, there must be a God. If there is no God, someone will rise and fill the societal, political, and metaphysical vacuum God left. With godlike powers, a ruler is no equal to everyone else in this fundamental sense. To John Locke and our founding fathers, a liberal is, quote, "someone who believes that man is naturally free and equal," close quote, according to Professor Ruth Grant in her book, John Locke's Liberalism. Here's why a Lockean liberal, by definition, believes in God. Equality requires a hierarchy, as we've seen. We are only equal if there is a God above us all and the rest of nature below us all. If that were not the case, then nature would abhor a vacuum, and so would the position of God. 2. Locke and the founders believe that a liberal is one who believes that, quote, "man is naturally free and equal." So if a liberal believes that man is equal and equality requires a hierarchy, and that hierarchy must include God, then we can conclude that to be a liberal, one must believe in God. Because a Lockean liberal believes in an individual's natural rights, he also necessarily believes in God. He's not necessarily a Christian, but he's no atheist. For Locke and for liberals, the hierarchy inherent in equality requires God. And people believed in God at the time of our nation's founding. The founding fathers were deists and Christians. There were also many Jews and even Muslims in America, but not too many atheists, even though we already had a tradition of relatively strong religious tolerance. But we had a philosophical understanding of nature that we're in the midst of skimming over in this series. And in that intellectual environment, an atheist's views wouldn't have shown him to great advantage. So a liberal, by definition, believes in God. For you conservative Christians out there, it's kind of fun to say it, right? A liberal, by definition, believes in God. Of course, this isn't true about what's called liberalism today, or about what's called conservatism today, for that matter. Later, we'll compare the philosophical underpinnings of Lockean liberalism with modern versions of liberalism and conservatism. Now, Locke doesn't say that a culture acknowledging the rights of man before God must acknowledge the Christian God. Although Locke was a Christian, he didn't believe that a nation needed to have a Christian heritage or understanding in order to function well under natural law. And of course, believing in God doesn't keep someone from murdering or enslaving others necessarily. Many individuals and rulers kill in God's name, but they do so after convincing themselves and perhaps others that God doesn't see all men as equal, that God, in creating the condemned people or in judging the condemned people, considers them less than human and not worthy to live. So a religious regime can violate God's hierarchy as easily as an atheistic one can. How does equality fit in with the kingdom of God principles such as authority and submission? Beautifully. Submission doesn't imply a denial of fundamental rights. Like natural law, the kingdom model also includes due process and appeals. Jesus' protocol in Matthew 18 concerning what to do if a brother offends you is a good example. In the Bible, we see both proper hierarchies among men, as well as this more fundamental hierarchy among God, man, and nature that I've been referring to. It's not a contradiction. Consider teachers. Paul called himself a teacher, and he described elders as able to teach. But elsewhere, Jesus said, quote, "And do not be called rabbi, For one is your teacher, and you are all brothers." Close quote. Is this a contradiction? No. Paul's proclamation and the establishment of teaching elders among the gifts in 1 Corinthians 12 and Ephesians 4 have to do with a proper hierarchy, submission, and deference among men. Jesus, though, addresses the more fundamental hierarchy among God, men, and beasts. Civil government is the same way. In our republic, the president and Congress, governors, legislatures, and state government, justices of Supreme Courts, are part of a hierarchy or hierarchies that place them above the rest of us. But their positions do not permit them to violate natural law, to take on the role reserved only for God. This is an important distinction, and it keeps us from conflating these two senses of equality. Natural law equality isn't income equality, for instance. George Orwell's crack about communism in his book Animal Farm, some animals are more equal than others, doesn't apply in a regime operating properly under natural law. And while we're on the subject of American government, it's important to note that natural law doesn't require American democracy or any kind of democracy. So don't associate these principles only with our democracy. John Locke himself creates no utopia in his writings, no understanding of government that would make any political system impervious to tyranny. He never lays out a political system at all, in fact, though he claims that lots of types of governments can operate fully within his natural law theory of government: democracies, aristocracies, hereditary monarchies, and even tribal kingdoms. By the way, getting back to the Holocaust and the Nazis' efforts to transform the Jews into animals in Germans' eyes before they killed them, the Allies had a problem at the end of World War II. At the outset of the Nuremberg Trials, the Allied judges and prosecutors realized that the Nazis hadn't broken any laws by killing their Jewish population. The Third Reich didn't recognize natural law, and German positive law sanctioned the killing of Jews inside its borders. What did the court do? It quickly arrived at something called, quote-unquote, crimes against humanity, a phrase borrowed from the 1860 Republican platform describing the slave trade. These crimes against humanity were based on natural law. Problem solved. The Nazis were successfully prosecuted thanks to natural law. Natural law made another comeback to judge a regime that was in no sense operating under it. I hope you're beginning to see how natural law and fundamental equality go hand in hand. And in the examples we've used from the Civil War era and the World War II era, I hope you're beginning to see also how natural law comes to the foreground at the time of our country's great existential crises to help bring man's positive law into closer alignment with God's most fundamental law. We'll need it again in our next national crisis, in whatever form it takes.